Hi guys, this video is going to be on the Pilgrims and their trip to America, so let's get started. Here are the three main ideas that you need to remember when studying the group that we now call the Pilgrims. Number 1. Religious tolerance was not considered a virtue, not even by the supposedly righteous Pilgrims. Part of having a monotheistic worldview is that there isn't a whole lot of room for competition. If there's only one God, then there can only be one way which he thinks we should act. And the Pilgrims, like every other monotheistic religious group of the time, feel that their particular interpretations match up with the one true God, and thus others are wrong. Number 2. Robert Brown, the founder of the Brownists, the group which the Pilgrims belonged, fled English persecution along with many others, but the voyage to America was a flight from Holland, not England, and from the liberal culture of Holland that the Pilgrims felt was too tolerant. And number 3, the desire to be free from the impositions of others did not make the Pilgrims hesitate to impose their own worldview on others. Please keep these three important points in mind throughout these next couple of videos and whenever you find yourself meditating on the Pilgrims. So here's where it all began. The Pilgrim origin story. Perhaps not as interesting as Batman's origin story, but hey, the Pilgrims are real and helped to establish a world superpower, so there's that. Robert Brown was the first to break away from the Church of England and founded a group that would be called the Brownists, people who believed that church power should be smaller and decentralized. Two important Brownists were Richard Clifton and William Brewster. These two led a congregation in Nottinghamshire, England, from 1586 until 1605, when they found themselves deemed nonconformists and thus enemies of the state/church. Another important Brownist was William Bradford. He would become an important member of the Pilgrims and kept a very detailed journal throughout his lifetime. It's through his writings that we see just how the nonconformists were harassed. He states that from order of Tobias Matthew, every dissenter was subject to fines, others were executed, some had troops placed at their homes and were watched throughout the day. All were ridiculed, and many were forced from their professions and family homes. Due to this harassment, Clifton's congregation flees for the tolerance of Holland. But they have to sneak out of the country illegally because, hey, we want to ignore the king's edict and his religion so we can continue to make a culture that will destroy yours isn't exactly a great way to get a passport. The group is arrested on their initial attempt, but eventually escapes to Holland. But Holland wasn't all tulips and windmills like the brochure said, and many of the immigrants found that the Dutch language was hard to master, and that the pace of the big city work in Amsterdam just didn't jive with their backgrounds in the more rural Nottinghamshire farm life. To get away from the big city, the congregation moved to the smaller city of Leyden, Holland. But even with the change, the group was still mostly confined to ghettos, with Brewster and Bradford, the church's leaders at that time, living in a neighborhood called Stink Alley, which is just terrible for self-esteem, let alone resale value. On top of the pungent poverty issues, there was also the fear among many Congregationalists that perhaps Holland was too liberal. This point that the Pilgrims' voyage to the New World was encouraged by toleration, not persecution, is important in clearing up some of the myths that surround the Pilgrims. It is true that their church leader William Brewster got into trouble for publishing Perth's Assembly, a work written by David Calderwood in 1619, in which he attacks the Church of England and the king's control of Scotland. But the future Pilgrims were already working on getting a charter, essentially granting legal access to land, in America in the year 1617. The reason stated by Brewster and other Pilgrims was that their children were becoming more Dutch than English, that they longed for more pleasant rural work, and that they feared possible reconquest of Holland by the Spanish, who had recently had to grant Netherlands independence in the 80 Years' War. But they also cite the more idealistic reason that they were excited in the opportunity to bring the word of Christ to a, quote, remote foreign land. There are actually two promised lands considered. The first is the Guianas, and the other somewhere around the Virginia colony in England. The Guianas were at that time Dutch colonies on rural South America, and therefore offered a lifestyle change without the fear of British intervention. The Virginia colony offered a rural life as well, but with the fear that the British would still try to persecute them. Even with the fear of persecution, however, the Virginia colony also offered them the preservation of their English language and tradition. And so, somewhere near Virginia eventually became a land patent to settle at the mouth of the Hudson River at the location of modern-day New York. The group then hires two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. It's important to stop here and note that no matter what your movement or cause is, you need money to make it happen. The want to set up a pilgrim paradise didn't pay for the boats and supplies and the captain and the crew. The church members all had to contribute to paying for the tickets, some were forced to stay behind and meet up with the group later, and the passengers were not all religious missionaries. About half were adventurers and businessmen. This was a high ideal journey for the Pilgrims, but to others it was just another business venture that was deemed worth the risk. As transatlantic voyages go, this one did not have the most promising start. The plan was for the Speedwell to meet up with the Mayflower in Southampton, England. The Mayflower headed out from London and arrived at Southampton without incident. But when the Speedwell left Defthaven, they quickly realized that the ship was leaking. The Speedwell got repairs in Southampton, and the two ships embarked on their journey to America with 30 passengers on the Speedwell and 90 on the Mayflower. But the Speedwell started to leak again, and so the pair pulled into the nearby port of Dartmouth for more repairs. So now the freshly patched Speedwell and the sturdy Mayflower are ready for their voyage and leave Dartmouth. But again, about 300 miles offshore, the Speedwell starts to leak, taking on water, and is forced to seek even more repairs at the port city of Plymouth. Now there are theories that it was really the passengers on the Speedwell that were sabotaging the ship in an attempt to avoid the hazardous 3,000-mile trip across turbulent seas from England to America. That being so, there are still a few passengers from the Speedwell that wanted to see the promised land and cram themselves and their supplies onto the Mayflower, and finally, on September 6, 1620, the Mayflower sailed out from Plymouth solo on its way to America. I want to pause the narrative a bit and actually talk about the Mayflower as a ship and what life on it was like. Some quick stats: it was about 180 tons, had an 80 to 90 foot deck, 100 to 110 feet overall, which is massive, about the size of a 10-story building and weighing 360,000 pounds. When it left Plymouth, it had 102 passengers, 30 crew, which means only about 12 people from the Speedwell switched over. It had 3 primary decks, the main deck, which you see, the gun deck right below it, and the cargo hold below that. It also had 30 feet tall masts, which is great for speed, but terrible for storms. The bigger the storm, the more likely it is to snap the mast of the ship, killing your passengers and crew and leaving you stranded out in the middle of the ocean. Which is exactly why they left in September, which is only, the exact middle of hurricane season. To make matters worse for the passengers, they all had to sleep on the gun deck, not having their own individual rooms and unlimited buffets like modern cruises, which meant they slept in close quarters with strangers and animals. And the goats weren't exactly keen on using the metal pot, which was your only form of a bathroom. The gun deck itself was a 55 by 25 foot room, which may sound big to you until you realize that's only 1,375 square feet, about the size of a 3-bed, 2-bath house. And it had to fit 92 people and some animals, and to make it worse, there was only a 5-foot ceiling. But back to the trip. It was pretty calm through October with just some mild seasickness, but then the fall storms took their toll, causing the Mayflower to get off track, and instead of landing in modern-day New York City, they ended up at the fist of the arm that extends from Massachusetts, also known as Cape Cod. The voyage itself across the Atlantic Ocean took 66 days from their departure on September 6th until Cape Cod was sighted on sunrise on November 9th, but even after the troubled voyage, they still tried to make it to the Hudson River. But they hit even more bad weather and said, come to think of it, that cape wasn't so bad. U-turned and anchored off of what would eventually be called Provincetown, Massachusetts. As a side note, the area was named New England by the unimaginative explorer John Smith in 1616. but had only been officially chosen as a name on November 3rd, 1620, which was only 6 days before the Pilgrims sighted their promised land. It was while anchored off the coast of Provincetown that the Mayflower Compact was written up and signed by 41 of the Pilgrims on board, making it the first governing document ever to be written in what would become the United States. But it's also important to point out why it was drawn up in the first place. The Pilgrim leaders decided that their colony needed to establish laws as soon as possible, in reaction to some passengers saying they, quote, would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them, referencing the fact that they were now far away from the established Virginia colony. Fear of anarchy motivated the compact signers, and the document itself really didn't say much except for to recognize the English king as their lord and protector, and to make a precedent for the future that all would work together for the betterment of their new society. And we'll learn more about that society in the next video.